Okay, in the third short video from this week, I want to look at an object called a sedge, which is a plant that grows along the Nile. Sedges actually grow all over the world, but in this case, we'll just look at the ones that grow along the Nile, especially when in wetter areas, which makes sense along the Nile. I do want to start off this video by saying the reason I want to look at this is because we're about to get to the end of the Old Kingdom. And we haven't covered this yet, but what happens at the end of the Old Kingdom is that things start to fall apart a little. So the central government becomes decentralized, and lots of other things are happening, and you get sort of a collapse of the government, and that runs into the first intermediate period, which we will look at next week. So this is just sort of an introduction to that whole process. So what we've looked at so far, so the Old Kingdom is a period called the Pyramid Age, obviously because they built all of those pyramids, especially at the very beginning. And we've looked at this topic so many times. You've got a massive economy, which is built upon religion and, of course, the government, both tied together. You have this massive distribution system that took care of all the people that were building these massive building structures during the Old Kingdom. And of course, all of this is dependent on agriculture. Now, a couple weeks ago, I told you about how the Old Kingdom government was set up. So at this point, you've got these nomes or states within the territory of Egypt, and you've got governors. So that's how all of this stuff is being organized. Now, we've talked about this too in a previous slide, where towards the end of the Old Kingdom, you've got this massive building projects. They start to slow down or actually aren't ever built. And this is the slide I've shown you before. So this is starting with the Old Kingdom. You've got the pyramids, more than one, built by Sneferu. And then this is the Great Pyramid. And then these are the others. Here's Menkaure, slightly smaller, quite a bit smaller pyramid of those three pyramids that we looked at. And then what's more important for our purposes today is that you go along the timeline, like here's the Old Kingdom, and here's this period called the First Intermediate Period where you've got a breakdown of the government. Notice that there are no buildings being built. In fact, notice, and we've looked at this too, this trend at this massive drop-off trend, and then you get a few more buildings being built by these pharaohs during the late Old Kingdom, and then it drops off to nothing. Now the Middle Kingdom starts, which we haven't talked about yet, and then they start to build slightly larger buildings. But this is the drop-off that I was talking about into the First Intermediate Period, where you've got a loss of central power and the rise of these nomarchs, and then other problems that are happening, probably due to weather. So if you look at the research, there's a couple of different reasons why some scholars think that the Old Kingdom fell. So as I said, the research is mixed. So if you look at some of the earlier scholarship, the Old Kingdom fell due to environmental problems, meaning it got drier, even more dry than it was, and you get less flooding of the Nile and so on. However, as you look a little bit later in the research, you see that it's really being blamed on the rise of these governors or these nomarchs who are gathering up power, and then it takes away the power of the pharaoh, and then that causes a breakdown of the whole system, and you get less buildings being built. Now, and I've given you an article to read this week from 2019, where more research is sort of moving us back into the environmental issues, where it becomes drier, it becomes a strain on the economy, and a strain on everything else. And so you get a breakdown of centralized power because of environmental issues. Okay, in terms of sustainability, so we know that as the Old Kingdom moves onward in time, it does get drier. And now I've done sort of a little chain thought here. So the Nile flows lessen, meaning, or get smaller, meaning less flooding. Less flooding means less agricultural land and, of course, less food. If you think about it, less food means less food to eat, and people then go hungry, and government work can't be done. So it's sort of this chain reaction following drier weather. Now, I did put down at the bottom all these things, except for the Nile flooding less, could be because the pharaoh has less power. and isn't able to control the whole supply chain. So that's why, more than likely, the answer to why the Old Kingdom fell is probably a mix of this. But I tend to be more on the side of the environmental issues causing most of this. So the article I had you read, or one of them, was called Nile Delta Vegetation Response to the Holocene Climate Variability. And it looks at pollen, which we've looked at before, and it looks at charcoal levels. So both of these you should be familiar with looking at in terms of scientific data. At the very beginning of the class, I mentioned the African humid period. So from about 6,000 to 3,500 BC, where it was wetter in ancient Egypt than it was a bit later. Now, one thing I didn't mention at that point is something called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or the ITCZ. What this is where the trade winds sort of come together at the equator, and it really regulates weather in that area. Now, we know that just before the Old Kingdom, this whole layer, or convergence zone, drifted to the south. So, meaning the area where you get lots of rainfall that feeds the Nile wasn't getting as much. So this meant less rain and therefore less flooding or lower floods on the Nile. We do know, which is really interesting, something called the 4200 BP event. And if you took my course on sustainability in the ancient world, you know all about this particular event because it had effects all throughout the Mediterranean where things got drier and lots of civilizations started to fall because of that, because of the same reason that the Old Kingdom starts to fall, because they're dependent on the environment or on rain to feed their crops. And when that doesn't fall, then it causes issues. So around 2200 BC, the science is telling us that pollen from these sedges starts to decrease. And this particular article is focused in the Delta region, so in northern Egypt. And so these plants grow along the Nile, and when they're happy, they give lots of pollen. When there's not so many of them, there's not as much pollen. So that's probably what's happening here. And so what you have is the climate getting drier, there's fewer floods, and these plants are not surviving as well as they normally do. And so their pollen decreases because the numbers of plants are decreasing. You also see an increase in charcoal. We've talked about that before. That usually indicates fires. Sometimes human set, sometimes not, but in this case, it's probably more based on people setting more fires because they're congregating closer to the Nile, which is where they have to grow their food. This is from page 617 on that article. And what I want you to really look at is here. So 4,000 years before present, it's about 2000 BC, so the end of the Old Kingdom. And what they've done on this chart is they've looked at the amount of pollen in these sedges, the percent. So like, here's a large amount of pollen they're finding, here's no pollen. And what they've done is they've assumed that 50% is where the Nile would normally flow. And when you've got high levels of pollen, you're probably getting higher flows of the Nile. And then that's also the case when you've got lower pollen counts, you're getting lower flows of the Nile. So this is the area you want to concentrate on. So you can see this is a fairly big area in terms of time range, so about 4,800 to 4,000 before present. And you can see a big drop in the pollen from the sedges. And so what that's probably corresponding to is a decreased flow of the Nile. And then we also have other records that talk about decreased flow of the Nile. So all this is related. And then here you've got dust counts, where it's actually getting dustier during this period, and that makes sense. Okay, and I mentioned other studies. So if you remember a few weeks ago, I had you read a few other articles that talked about pollen counts and charcoal counts, especially in the Delta. And a lot of this is being brought together in a few articles where they've taken the research from one and they're talking about it in another. Other research also shows differences in plant life or in animal life in the Delta, so especially with mollusks. So what they've looked at is that mollusks survive at sort of a certain type of salinity. And so the Nile water is fresh and it's flowing northwards. It flows out into the Mediterranean, which is salty. So if you've got a slower flow or no flow of the Nile, the Mediterranean can back up into the Delta. and changes the salinity or the salt levels of the water. And so lower fresh water flows, meaning more inflow from the Mediterranean, meaning saltier. So plants and animals live in like where is the most appropriate for them. And if the salinity changes, then it can change the plant life and the animal life. And there's also studies that look at an area called the Fayum. If you look at your atlas, you'll see that this is a large lake. And so they've looked at sediment changes, and it looks like there's quite a bit of change happening around this 4200 before present event, or right around the end of the Old Kingdom. Now, what can this pollen and charcoal tell us about sustainability? It's really the same answers that we looked at before. So Egypt, of course, is totally dependent on the climate. And when you have water flowing normally in the good years, then things are good. So you have good crop yields, good rations to send out to people, large buildings can be made during that period of time. If the climate gets drier and the Nile flows are reduced, then things can start breaking down. And that's probably what's happening at the end of the Old Kingdom and at the beginning of the first intermediate period, which is what we'll look at next week.